Is there a God?
It is the most important question that exists. When I say that I'm violently agnostic, I'm talking about the existence of God.
If there is a God and I'm ignoring that feels like a really bad way to live your life, much less whatever comes after. If there isn't a God and I'm wasting my time by worshiping something that's not there, that's a really bad outcome too. This is a really important question.
The question we're exploring today is a big one. Does God exist? And to tackle this question, we've brought in two intellectual powerhouses. On one side, we have Alex O'Connor, the Oxford philosopher and atheist who rose to fame as a teenager, debating people 3 times his age. Alex recently crossed 1 million subscribers on YouTube. On the other hand, we have Dr. Francis Collins, the former director of the Human Genome Project and the best-selling author of The Language of God. Dr. Collins is widely celebrated as one of the most decorated scientists in modern history.
The problem of evil,
It's a hard problem, I will grant you that.
it seems trivially true to me that an omnipotent deity could have organized the world so that there was not this kind of suffering.
Now, I entered medical school as an atheist and then recognized that point of view could not really hold up to even rational argument.
What do we find? The existence of a universe. Okay, score 1 for theism, because that is pretty incredible. Something rather than nothing, finely tuned constant. Once you get past that sort of fundamental origin point, the resurrection is a strange moment in history. Like something very weird happened on Easter morning.
The most likely explanation is that he really was raised from the dead
How do we know that?
because of...
Do you know that God exists? Like, are you certain about it?
Doesn't sound to me like you're 100% sure you're right. And can you imagine such a thing that would change your mind?
When people asked me, what would it take? I would say,
Today, we dive into perhaps the most important question to human existence. Does God exist? For millennia, this question has echoed through ancient temples, fueled debates among the greatest minds, and inspired both scientific inquiry and spiritual exploration. It transcends cultures, generations, and beliefs, challenging us to confront the deepest aspects of our reality. Whether approached with faith, skepticism, or sheer curiosity, the pursuit of an answer has been a cornerstone of human history, shaping civilizations and guiding individual lives. What you believe about the existence in God, and by extension, who or what God might be, has the power to profoundly influence your worldview, values, and the course of your life. To explore this question from opposing perspectives, we couldn't think of two better guests than Alex O'Connor and Dr. Francis Collins. Alex is an Oxford philosopher and self-proclaimed atheist who has described himself as violently agnostic about the existence of God. In recent years, he's gained substantial recognition in the academic world and beyond, with nearly 1 million subscribers on YouTube. His show has featured intellectual heavyweights like Jordan Peterson, Richard Dawkins, William Lane Craig, and Sam Harris. On the other side of the conversation, we have Dr. Francis Collins, one of the most distinguished scientists of our time. From 1993 to 2003, he led the Human Genome Project, the monumental effort to map all human genes. Dr. Collins is perhaps the most famous scientist to transition from atheism to belief in God, famously chronicling his journey in the New York Times bestseller, The Language of God. In it, he presents compelling arguments for the existence of a higher power. In this episode, we explore the various lines of evidence for and against the existence of God. We begin by diving into the concept of evidence itself before delving into topics such as the fine-tuning of the universe, the moral argument, the resurrection of Jesus, and the world's holy texts. This was a deeply stimulating conversation, and we believe it will be for you as well. So join us as we navigate the complexities, the debates, and the profound mysteries surrounding the existence of God.
all right, gentlemen, thank you for being here today. The question we're exploring today is, does God exist? And by extension of that, if he does exist, is he actually knowable? So I thought it'd be a good starting point to explore just kind of brief, like your personal stories, what your position is currently. Alex, I thought we would start with you. I've heard you describe yourself as an atheist, but most recently I was watching an interview, you said violently agnostic about God's existence. So what's your current position and how did you arrive there? In the online atheist community, atheism is sometimes defined as just a lack of belief in God. It's actually something that's pressed quite a lot. People have wasted a lot of ink over this particular question of what it means. And so I think when I was calling myself a hardcore atheist, I would have been the kind of atheist that says, well, I just lack a belief in God, and that's all atheism is.
I find that the agnostic label is a bit more accurate when I'm sort of having general conversations with people to explain where I'm at, which is I obviously can't say that God doesn't exist. Interestingly, when somebody says, well, I know you say you're an atheist, but do you know that God doesn't exist? Or are you technically an agnostic? Fine. But a lot of the time when I speak to a Christian or a theist, and I say, but do you know that God exists? Like, are you certain about it? And they go, well, no, I'm not certain, but I believe it. And I wouldn't say, oh, well, technically you're an agnostic then. Because really what you're saying is sort of, what side broadly do you fall on here? And for me, when observing the world around me, I find so many inexplicable mysteries. So I have to die on that fence of agnosticism, as I put it before. But if you ask me to sort of place a bet, I think that I'm at least suspicious of the idea that this is compatible with a traditional creator type figure, and so I'd sort of fall in that camp. But strictly speaking, I have no idea, and sorry to disappoint, but I'm not sure we'll get to the bottom of the question today.
Oh,
but
yeah.
we'll
counting on that.
We'll do the best that we can.
How would you? I mean, obviously, in the early 2000s, New Atheism, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harrison, Christopher Hitchens. How would you differentiate the way you think about this question versus maybe the way that they would have thought about this question, if at all?
Well, New Atheism is made up of two components: that God doesn't exist and that religion is evil. There's nothing new about atheism. People haven't believed in God for just about as long as they have. Humanity, I mean. The thing that's different about the New Atheists is that they came along and they did the sociological analysis and sort of like, people don't believe in God anymore. This isn't really part of our culture. But they said, but we don't need it, because you can regain your spiritual autonomy and we can ground our ethics in secular humanism and the virtues of, if it's Christopher Hitchens, Thomas Paine and the American founding fathers. And that, I think, is where I have to depart company, because I think that saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. It's kind of, I get why someone would say that, it's kind of true, but it's a little bit naive of a statement. It doesn't mean that there isn't a correct political position. I mean, I could say that politics has caused all kinds of wars and politics has driven people apart, and that's true. But it'd be naive to say, therefore, we can throw off politics and all be anarchists. You can still think that there's a correct political position, or that having or developing a better relationship with politics and a more thought out political view would help that problem. But to sort of throw it out altogether, I think is maybe a mistake. The trouble I find myself in is that I can't say, religion is terrible and evil and we're better off without it, but I just don't believe that it's true.
Yeah.
And so I can't lie to my children for want of a better society. So I'm in a bit of a tough spot. I'm agnostic as well on that question, in other words. Whereas they would say religion is bad, I would say I don't know. I think it's probably too simplistic an analysis.
Well, I appreciate your channel and the curiosity that you bring to each episode, and I could really feel that and feel even what you're saying right now. And so I think that's a very interesting way to go about it. Francis, what about you? What's your current position and how'd you arrive there?
I appreciate what Alex is saying, that sometimes we try to put these categories of belief or non-belief into very specific subsets. Maybe we trichotomize it. You're an atheist or you're agnostic or you're a believer. I think it's really much more of a spectrum. And I think I've traveled across that spectrum during my whole life and not found it like I was jumping from one box to the other. It was sort of sliding along and then going, well, maybe not, and then this way. So let me tell you how it started. I was born in a family about 3 hours from here in Virginia. My dad was a college professor. My mother was a playwright. We lived on a farm that had no indoor plumbing. There was no interest in faith in my childhood upbringing. It wasn't denigrated. It just wasn't considered to be relevant or important. It was all about music and theater and the arts and literature and a bit of history. I did not go to public school until the 6th grade, and not for religious reasons. It's because my parents thought they were better teachers than what was available in the public schools in that county. And they were right. So I learned a lot from my mom and dad, particularly about the joy of learning new things, which I carry with me my whole life. But I didn't learn a thing about what religion was all about or whether God exists. So in that spectrum where atheism's over here and really strong, no doubt in your mind belief is over here, I was undefined. And then I landed in college, and you know how it is, those 2 o'clock in the morning discussions for what do you believe and what do you believe? I thought the atheists had the better hand in those conversations and decided, okay, I'll throw myself in with that lot. So I was an atheist, left college, went to graduate school, studied quantum mechanics, loved the mathematics, loved the beauty of science, that equations could describe things. Didn't occur to me that that might not have been the obvious outcome for the universe, but I was completely focused on what you could call scientism, that any question that was worth asking was a scientific question, and any question that couldn't be answered that way was off the table. And then I had this change in my life plan about exactly where I wanted my professional career to go. I was a little bit disillusioned with the abstractness of what I was doing in quantum mechanics, even though it was kind of fun, and felt this urge to do something more directly connected to people. And so I went to medical school, which was quite a 180-degree turn scientifically from where I had been, thinking that life science was just much too messy. By the way, it is, but it mattered. Now, I entered medical school as an atheist over here on this end of the spectrum, and I left kicking and screaming, having crossed over all of those intermediates and landed somewhere over here as a Christian, but a Christian who had lots of questions and lots of doubts, but who had made the decision that this is true enough for me to throw myself into it and to have this be my foundation until there's some reason not to. And that was 47 years ago, and I'm still a Christian. And I have, waffled around a little bit over there on that end of the spectrum, depending on what kind of challenges come along. But the more I get deep into what the real foundation of that faith is, and particularly the person of Jesus, that's now such an anchor to the way I think about everything that I can't really imagine walking away from it. Can I prove it? No. Do I believe it? Yes.
Well, I think as we embark on this conversation, it's important to define terms. You said, "Can I prove it?" And you spoke about truth a lot in your latest book, and so you seem to make a distinction. I think this is important when we talk about God's existence because we throw around the term evidence. So you make a distinction between proof and evidence. So how would you differentiate those terms?
I think that's really important. The book I wrote 18 years ago about my own faith journey called The Language of God, the subtitle is A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. Not so. I don't think God intended for us to have proof. If there was, we would all be running around being good little believers, following what is incontrovertible evidence that we absolutely have to accept this. I think God had in mind something much more interesting and something that called more to us to make a decision, not to have it forced upon you by some mathematical proof. And maybe, what is it, Eugene Peterson said, if God wanted us to have a mathematical proof, it would have been tough to say, I love you in algebra. There's a lot more here than what you would call that sort of a proof. So I do think there's evidence, and I can tick off a few of the things that appealed to me as I was kicking and screaming, giving up my atheism and ultimately my agnosticism, because I didn't want to recognize that there was a lot here that was hard to dismiss. Some of it, of course, is the nature of the universe and how it's put together, and we may end up talking about that.
Yeah, we will.
The fact that the universe did have a beginning, and that seems to cry out for a cause. Here we are in Kalam. And that it has this remarkable fine-tuning of all these constants that even the astronomer Martin Rees, who's not a believer, that wonderful book he wrote about 6 numbers, seemed to have had the dial set in an exquisitely careful way in order for there to be anything interesting here, and not just a bunch of particles. So, of course, the retreat from that is the multiverse option, which is an option, but seems to me require at least as much faith as the one that says, actually, there's an intelligence behind this that explains, Maxwell's equations that are the way in which electricity and magnetism operate. Simple, beautiful equations. As somebody who used to be in that field, first encountering Maxwell's equations, it's like, wow, this is like watching an incredible work of art being generated. Why should that be? It does seem to cry out for an intelligence. And of course, Einstein would have agreed with that part. Now we're just talking about deism, not theism. The theist part, for me, a lot of it comes down to the moral law, the idea that there's good and evil. And the ability to try to explain that purely on the basis of evolutionary psychology falls short with me. It doesn't explain the kind of radical altruism that we as humans tend to admire when we see it, and which is sometimes a scandal to evolution. Why should that be? So the moral law, and then the whole phenomenon of beauty. I don't find it easy to dismiss experiences that sort of lift me out of myself, which for me is often music. This exquisite longing, poignant longing that's inspired in your whole being by a particular beautiful piece of music. It feels like it's some kind of an outreach to your very soul. And I don't know how to explain that on the basis of neuroscience, although I imagine neuroscience will find there is some properties of the brain that supports it. So again, not a proof, but for me at 27, having walked down this trail bit by bit, realizing that my arguments of strict atheism really couldn't be sustained, I got to that place where I had to decide whether to take the leap. There was no going back. That had already crumbled behind me. And the only real alternative was to stay in this awkward, uncertain space, or to say, okay, I find it no longer possible to stay there and to resist.
Yeah, that's good.
Trust you, God, to meet me on the other side of that gap.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke a lot of different areas, philosophical arguments, science. I'm curious how you go about this process. You had a couple videos on your YouTube channel, arguments for atheism and arguments for theism as well. And so I'm just curious to unpack your mind on like how you think about this in terms of evidence and reason and all that stuff.
Yeah, well, when I say that I'm violently agnostic, I'm talking about the existence of God. I don't know what God is. I don't know what this word is supposed to refer to, right? And I remember, like, for some reason this stuck out to me. I was speaking to somebody once who's not really into philosophy or science or anything, and we were just talking, and he sort of said, yeah, well, I don't believe in God, and carried on talking. And something about the way he said it, I just thought to myself, what is the thing that you have in your head when you say that? Like, what is the referent for the word God there? What is the thing that you don't believe in? The cliche is for the Christian to find out and say, well, guess what? I don't believe in that God either, whatever it is that you have in mind. But it's true, because God is, if we listen to the way that God is described in Scripture, but also in the traditional philosophical schools of thought, it's not the man in the sky, but it's also not like a creative mind. I mean, Aquinas would say that God is not even powerful. God is not like loving. God is not knowing. God is not any of those things, because those are all just analogous terms that somewhat approximate the kind of thing that God might be like, right? And so if there is a God, I think it's sort of far beyond comprehension. And so my agnosticism is partly due to that. I think that without the guidance of some form of Scripture, the reason we know that we can use these analogies accurately, even if we can't understand the thing they point to, is because we have it on the authority of someone like Jesus. The problem is that my agnosticism doesn't extend to religious traditions like Christianity. Those I unfortunately do think are false. At the very least, I don't think there's good enough evidence to believe in the truth claims of Christianity, the crucial parts of the resurrection, for example. That's a sticking point for a lot of people. That brings a lot of people to faith. It doesn't do it for me. Also, the moral qualms, the same moral intuition that I'm told I'm supposed to rely upon to prove the existence of God, is that same moral intuition that I'm supposed to ignore when I encounter the less than enviable situations of the Canaanites,
the Old
or
Testament,
Hebrew slaves or non-Hebrew slaves, to make things worse. But also in the New Testament, the treatment of women is something that raises a lot of eyebrows. Interestingly, I think the atheist has an escape route there, because I think that Paul didn't write a lot of what we find attributed to Paul in the New Testament. But that's not really an option for the New Testament trusting Christian. So I'm sort of the one who can absolve Paul here. I don't think he wrote those words in 1 Corinthians where he says that women should, if they have a question, they should go home and ask their husbands. It's a disgrace to them to speak in church. I don't think he wrote those words, and I think we have good evidence to think he didn't. I don't think he wrote the entire book of 1 Timothy. And so a lot of those problems sort of go away for me. But if I'm looking at the Christian religion, that moral intuition that so powerfully tells people, well, you know certain things are right or wrong. You know it. Even if you want to sort of try to psychologize it or talk about evolution or anything, you know somewhere that there's a moral feeling that certain things are right or wrong. And even if I say, okay, sure, yeah, great. So what does that mean I should do? Well, that should lead you to Christianity. And then the first thing I see opening that book is something which contradicts the very moral intuition that I was supposed to use to get there in the first place. That leaves me with some cause for concern. When it comes to the actual existence of God, the fine-tuning and the first cause type stuff, I'm kind of okay with this. What are we thinking about God as being? If we think of God as someone who's sort of like finely tuning constants, the strong and weak nuclear forces and the gravitational constant, sort of like almost like typing them all into a computer or something, then we're starting to imagine God as more of this sort of intervening agency, which is what I was trying to avoid before. I do have specific responses to each of these arguments, by the way. So like the fine-tuning, or the first cause stuff, whatever, which we can do. Yeah. But just as a broad overview, I find it impossible to really say what would count as evidence or proof of God's existence, because I don't even know what this God figure is. Yeah. But I do know that the religious traditions that have sprung up in response to apprehension of the divine have given me cause for concern.
Yeah, I mean, well, Francis was talking about faith being a spectrum. I think also looking at this question and zooming out, and I do want to zoom out because if you subscribe to a particular belief system like Christianity, there are things from the Bible that we learn about God, right? But I think a lot of people are in this place of, like you're talking about, agnosticism, where, even if fine-tuning were true, like, does that necessarily indicate that that is the Christian version of the God? And so we have, atheism, agnosticism, then we have maybe deism or theism, which is like a more detached picture with deism of maybe a creator, but isn't necessarily this loving depiction of God seen through Jesus. And so I kind of want to work through each of those individual points. And so you both mentioned the fine-tuning of the universe. And so that discovery comes from science. And so in your last interview with Richard Dawkins, he said this was the nearest approach to a good argument. And so considering most people are listening to this are novices to science, can you unpack what fine-tuning is?
Sure. And it's a fairly recent realization, actually. We do have this remarkable set of equations that govern the behavior of matter and energy. The gravity it follows an inverse square law, that the speed of light is fixed, that all of the properties of the atom follow certain abilities and rules about how they stick together or fly apart. Those laws, beautiful as they are, have constants in them that I don't know really anybody who will say we can derive the value of those constants from first principles. They're related to each other, so maybe there's some connection between them, but you can't figure out what they have to be on the basis of theory. You have to go and measure them. And so they have a particular value. And maybe the easiest one to explain is gravity, because that's certainly familiar to us in everyday life. So there's that inverse square law, and there's the gravitational constant. And that is, of course, important in the beginning of the universe for the way in which, after an inflationary period of everything flying apart, they began to actually coalesce. And that's how we got clouds of gas, which then became ultimately stars and planets and moons and ultimately us here talking about it. So gravity is pretty important. But if you tweak the value of that gravitational constant just a little bit, depending on who you ask and whose calculation you did, I mean a very little bit, maybe 1 part in a million.
What is the 1 part in a million?
One?
Like, how can you contextualize that?
Okay, if you imagine the gravitational constant out to 7 decimal places, and you change that last decimal place that was an 8 into a 7, and the rest is all the same. And then you go through the math about what would happen if it was just a little bit weaker. There isn't quite enough there to get the coalescence to happen. And so you end up with things just flying apart in a pretty boring, sterile way. If you make it just a little stronger, then things come together a little sooner. but also the expansion of the universe has a limit. And knowing that it takes billions of years before you get to the point where something like complexity of chemistry can happen because of all the things that have to happen in stars, you'd never get to that point. Everything would collapse back in a big crunch. So in order to have this possibility of something beautiful and interesting, that had to have exactly that. And the strong and the weak nuclear force and multiple other constants all have to have that same property.
So you're talking about like the conditions needed for life to exist on Earth.
Or for anything interesting. It's not just about this kind of life or this kind of Earth, just anything beyond some particles, which hard to me imagine much intelligence coming out of particles flying apart by themselves. So anything that you would call thought seems to require these particular parameters to be set in a very precise way. And that seems to cry out for an explanation. And again, as somebody who also finds beauty in the equations, I find awe in the values of those constants, and they do call out to me for an intelligence that is far beyond anything I could possibly imagine, who I don't think had to sit there and punch it, just knew and thought, and here it was. And I get it, that the alternative is that there are an infinite number of other parallel universes. And of course, we have to be in the one where something interesting could happen to have this conversation. But the inability to ever measure, except in the weirdest sort of way, the possibility that those really exist, seems then to require a great leap of faith to believe in the multiverse. Maybe for me, greater than believing in a creator who made it this way for our universe. So yeah, I think it seems a little too easy to dismiss that and go, well, it's the multiverse. Think about that. The other thing is, that doesn't solve the question of why there's something instead of nothing.
Yeah.
Sort of the big ultimate question. And that also seems to require some kind of an uncaused cause to have there be some.
Yeah. So, I mean, in essence, with fine tuning, I think I saw this online somewhere, but someone was saying like if you took a pencil or something and you like threw it across the universe at a bullseye on like Pluto or something, that and hitting it would be like, that would be the chances that life would exist or something. And so the argument essentially is that with fine tuning, life is just so incredibly unlikely that like, what is the explanation for that? And I've heard you talk about this a little bit in your podcast and interviews. And I think you said that you find this can be compelling, but it doesn't really move you really. But so can you explain what your take is?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's compelling. It's a great mystery, and it's an amazing finding, right? That if we were to adapt these values, then nothing could exist. There are so many questions that spring up in my mind. There are just so many. It's difficult to know where to begin. I mean, we said for a moment ago, God doesn't punch in those numbers. He just kind of knows that that's how it has to be.
He doesn't have to punch anything.
Is God constrained by these constants?
He chooses to be.
He chooses to be.
I don't know that in his existence those constants exist. He's not part. He created, but he is not himself part of the created universe.
So this is the thing that sort of confounds me, is that before the universe exists and you just have sort of God up in the ether, and he's sort of thinking about creating this universe, to put it crudely. And for some reason, God is confined to these very narrow restraints, and in fact could not create a life-permitting universe, but within those constraints. And and therefore, before this universe is even created, God is in some way constrained by the strong and weak nuclear forces.
I don't understand that at all. You're suggesting that God is part of the creation that God put in place for the universe. God doesn't have to be constrained that way. God is outside of space, outside of time.
Yeah.
Not basically having to adhere to any of such.
I don't mean that God is constrained by those forces, that they're like acting upon him. I mean that he's constrained in the sense that he can only create a material world that abides by those particular constraints.
Oh, I think you could create any material world. I think he wanted to create one that was interesting. And so he made the selection of those equations and those constants in order for it not to just be a big waste of time.
But would it have been impossible for him to create a universe that's life-emitting and just as interesting, in which gravity was stronger?
Well, I don't think it would have been as interesting. But God was interested in thought.
but I mean a thought-permitting universe, right? So like a universe where basically everything is the same as it is now. Let's say that that gravity is stronger, but this dark energy that's causing the universe to expand is a bit stronger, or there's some other introduced force, or in other words, when God goes to create the universe, is he constrained in the sense that if he wants to create this thought-permitting universe, that everything has to be so finely balanced? In other words, I'm not sure why the meta conditions are set up so that everything is on such a knife edge. Maybe I can spell it out like this, right? So imagine, I have a friend who, Phil Halper, who made this documentary about the fine-tuning argument. And there was a really interesting response that made reference to the Gnostic Christian tradition. The Christian Gnostics believed in the sort of the material world being the product of an evil demiurge. It's like this God of the Old Testament is the evil creator of the material world, and Jesus represents the true God, who is, spiritually pure and above all. And he was like, well, doesn't the fine-tuning argument kind of fit in better with this kind of picture of the universe? Why? Because the spiritual creator who realizes that the material world is evil and terrible doesn't want the material world to come about. And so he makes it so that it is near on impossible for a material universe like this to exist. And yet the evil demiurge wants to create that universe. And so he comes in and he perfectly tunes everything. So although it's completely improbable, he just makes it right that the material world can be created. But I think that this kind of slightly contrived image can help to demonstrate is that the very fact that it is so difficult to bring about the material world, but by finely tuning these constraints, is itself a sort of a backfiring against the existence of a creator God who wants there to be a universe like this and has the power to do it in any way which he pleases. For example, another analogy from the same documentary, if you were to have like a bag of balls, and you were pulling out a ball, and you were trying to figure out what the favorite color of the creator of the bag was, and you reach in and you pull out a purple ball, that might be confirming evidence that the creator of the game likes the color purple. But if you then tipped out every other ball and looked at every single other one except for the one that you picked was yellow, you might actually think to yourself, oh, okay, the creator of this game clearly prefers yellow, but I just happen to have picked the blue one. Now, obviously, that analogy doesn't work because that revolves around chance. But the point specifically being that if the conditions are set up so that there are an almost infinite number of ways that things could have been where none of this could have happened, and only one very precise way that it could have happened, the person who sets up that meta condition, what are we to make of their view of the universe? You see what I'm saying?
I think I see where you're going. And I don't think there's just one way where you could set the constants and the equations to end up with something interesting. This happens to be a really well-studied one that we happen to live in the middle of. Again, going back to Martin Rees' book, Just Six Constants, or whatever, it's close to that. He would argue that these constants are related to each other, so they don't have to have the precise values they do now, as long as their ratios are correct. So the six dimensionless constants that he outlines, including the cosmological constant. And if those are off by just a little bit, things don't work. But there's lots of solutions within that. So I think more of God is an artist. And of course, an artist can paint a lot of things that are really not very interesting, and then occasionally a masterpiece, but not usually just one masterpiece. So God has the opportunity to decide which of the masterpieces are going to be considered worth doing because they're interesting, and we live in one of those. I'm not saying it's the only one that could have been, it's just the one that we have, and it fits the description of what would need to be a very precise thought process to end up with something that would be more than just sterile particles.
Well, you keep using the word interesting, and it really makes me think of, I mean, the thing that sticks out about this whole thing is how unlikely it is that life would exist. And so it almost makes me think of even, in America, if there's an underdog sports team that wins, that is so incredibly unlikely that they would win, it sticks out to humans as something that's remarkable. And you keep talking about interesting and beautiful. Is that kind of really what you're getting at? Is that God made it interesting and that sticks out to us because of how unlikely it is?
Because it's unlikely and because it has complexity. I guess that's when I'm saying interesting. I don't think small particles flying apart forever is very interesting. I think something where you have a coalescence of stars and planets and chemistry that gives rise to amazing constructs, I think that's really interesting. And especially if it gives rise to something that allows, through an evolutionary process, the development of creatures with big, complicated brains that can have a conversation like this and can even feel some draw upon them somehow to reach back out to God, who we're not sure is there, but certainly feels like we're called to. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But to be clear, I mean, do you think that it would have been impossible for God to create that universe, that interesting universe in which atoms and nebulas and planets and humans ultimately form? It would have been impossible for him to do that with gravity being stronger.
I think it would not have been impossible. I don't think God chose to spend the energy of creation on something boring, at least just judging by what's around us.
So I mean to create the same universe. So not a boring universe. It's still an interesting universe. Everything is the same. We're still acting as we're acting now. It's just that gravity is stronger.
I think if that had happened, we would have had a big crunch before there was time for the complexity of chemistry to form in the heart of those stars, and it would have been not very...
So it would have been impossible for God to create that universe and there not be a big crunch.
I think if the only thing that was altered was gravity, everything else kept the same, the theoreticians would say, yeah, we had had a collapse of the universe before now. We would not have made it to 13.8 billion years.
So that means then that provided God wants to create this interesting universe as it is today, God is constrained in doing so.
He chooses.
By the conditions of gravity. Yeah, but so once he's made that choice that he wants this universe.
He wants an interesting.
He can't make that interesting universe but by this very specific value of the constant of gravity. And so that acts as a constraint on God's creative power. Because God wants to create this beautiful thing. It's kind of like saying, you know, if God wanted to create the Mona Lisa without using like a paintbrush, like traditionally, I think theists would want to say, well, he could do that. He could just pop it into existence. There are ways of God to sort of get around our physical constraints. And if I said, well, no, I think that God chose to use a paintbrush because otherwise the Mona Lisa couldn't have been created and that would have been uninteresting. But the question I'm asking is, could he have made the Mona Lisa without the paintbrush? Could he have created the world as interesting as it is today with a stronger force of gravity? You know what I mean? Like, I understand what you're saying, that he wouldn't choose to have a gravity that has a universe that has a big crunch because it wouldn't lead to life. That would be so uninteresting. But what I'm saying is, why couldn't there be a stronger constant of gravity that in our current model would lead to a big crunch? But because God is God, he can create that universe nonetheless and avoid a big crunch somehow. Or is he constrained by the constant of gravity and what he can create?
I think I see where you're going. I think God is a God of order. And that meant that in any universe, God would choose to have matter and energy follow orderly laws.
Mm-hmm.
We happen to have a set of those. They might have been otherwise. We haven't talked about whether you could come up with a completely different universe where gravity was an inverse cube instead of an inverse square. Mm-hmm. That sort of makes my head hurt. But within the nature of the laws that seem in this universe to govern matter and energy, if God is a God who's interested in something complex, and let's come back to my faith here, God is also a God of love. God wants to have creatures that God can have relationship with. And that is going to guide the decision-making then about what kind of universe will achieve that goal. I don't think it's constrained by the fact that God wants to love his creatures. That's who he is. And if that's the case, I don't know that it's constraining him in terms of physics to choose the right parameters to make that happen. It's a means to the end. The end is what mattered.
But he couldn't have got that same outcome through different parameters. That's the constraint that I'm talking about.
Unless you change the laws also, and I don't know how you would do that. If you're going to stick with the laws we've got and just change one constant, gravity, and expect that to end up with complexity, it won't work.
Even for God. Even God couldn't make that happen.
You know, This sort of feels like, well, God could decide 2 plus 2 can be 5. And that
Right. So but that's what I'm asking is are these fundamental constants something like, laws of logic, like 2 and 2 is 5, in which case, because if I ask a believer in God, do you think that God is constrained by the laws of logic? Oftentimes they say, in a sense, yes, but that's not really a problem because these are just the laws of logic. What I'm asking is, are things like the strong and weak nuclear force and the strength of gravity like the laws of logic, in that they plausibly constrain God in the way that the laws of logic might? That seems to me a really unusual thing. Like when someone says God couldn't make 2 plus 2 equal 5, I don't see that as a challenge to his omnipotence, because it's logically impossible. That kind of thing, like a four-sided triangle, he can't create that because it literally has no referent. It's not a thing. God can do all things. Four-sided triangles just aren't things. And so I totally understand that. But if it's, well, God couldn't create a life-permitting universe in which everything was the same except for gravity being 2 times as strong, he couldn't have done that. Well, I do see that as a challenge to his omnipotence, because that doesn't seem like a logical contradiction in the same way. It seems like a physical contradiction, but not a logical one.
I guess the other factor here that we haven't said explicitly is that God apparently is interested in nature following order. And the fact that there are those equations governing matter and energy, they didn't have to be there. But if you'll take as a given that God is interested in order of nature, and also that God is interested in having relationship with complicated creatures like us, then I think the only means to that end is to have that gravity constant in our universe be what it is. And so, yeah, I guess you could say there's a constraint there because otherwise God's goals are not achieved.
Well, I think the second point that you made, I think, lends to the next couple topics, because I think from someone who is in an agnostic position, it would feel like a jump to say that this being, let's just say that whatever, there was an intelligent designer behind the fine-tuning. Again, like I was mentioning earlier, that would only indicate that maybe a deist perspective of something created us. But then there's another further jump of this being wants to be in relationship with us, which kind of begs the question of, the moral argument that we were talking about. But then also kind of a line of reasoning that really popped up in my mind when you were talking about that of the reasoning you're using with the fine-tuning. I've also heard with the problem of evil one, which is basically that, couldn't have God created a world where there was free will and there wasn't evil, or there wasn't suffering or something like that, and people would have free roam.
I mean, there are questions to ask on either side here, right? And by the way, I offer these questions and objections to fine-tuning. I mean, it may just be that yes, God is, insofar as we grant that he has a particular will, he is constrained by things like the strong, weak nuclear force. That seems strange to me. That might just be true. And I still think it's a powerful argument. I'm not a scientist. I don't understand this. I'm sort of raising these questions, but I totally understand the power of the fine-tuning argument. I do. And so when confronted with the universe as we find it, I think the best thing we can do is ask on either hypothesis, atheism or theism, what we would expect to find, and then look at what we do find, right? And so what do we find? The existence of a universe. Okay, score 1 for theism, because that is pretty incredible. Something rather than nothing, finely tuned constants. That's great. Once you get past that sort of fundamental origin point, explaining those points, then we look at what the universe is. Okay, sort of mostly cold, lifeless place. Don't get me wrong, it's very beautiful and very, very cool and all of that.
Yeah.
But insofar as there isn't an observer to see that, there's no conscious life going on. Conscious life finally evolves on planet Earth, billions of years after the beginning of the universe, and does so in the most brutal imaginable way. Natural selection as the process by which humans came to be on this planet, which I'm told is the ultimate end of this entire vale of tears, was for the sake of humanity. And the mechanism that is chosen to bring that about, or maybe it was necessary, again, a further constraint on God, but it seems plausible that this naive popping into existence, Adam and Eve type thing could have been done, but it wasn't. What happened instead was a series of slow, brutal evolutions over billions of years in which 99% of the species, let alone the animals, who've ever lived on this planet have been wiped from existence, sometimes in the most painful imaginable circumstances. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and destruction of the unfit. The problem of evil always comes up in a human context. And people can say, okay, well, maybe evil exists because of human free will, or maybe because it develops our soul, or because it allows us to achieve higher order goods, things
So
like
you're saying
bravery.
it applies to animals as well. Then.
But animals have undergone much more suffering, at times in terms of the actual crude physical pain that they're feeling, but in terms of the numbers as well. Even just today, the number of animals alive experiencing pain and suffering in the wild is unfathomably huge. And so I ask, okay, what would I expect to see if this was being sort of organized with the intention of bringing about human beings, with the intention to enter into a loving relationship with them? I don't think I'd expect to see anything like this circus of suffering. And yet, if I assume that it's all mindlessly evolving accidentally in some competition for survival, in some like unconscious competition for survival, not only do we explain what we see in the history of our planet and the world today, but we also come to expect it. And so I think that this is definitely score one for atheism. And I understand the problem of evil. I'm not the first person to bring this up, right? But I do think that the theodicies that are often put forward about why evil exists, such as free will, such as soul building, such as higher order goods, just simply do not apply to the suffering of non-human animals. That seems to me utterly inexplicable. Even the very existence of animals at all seems superfluous and unnecessary if God creates the world with the intention to bring about human beings. Or maybe he creates animals because they're beautiful and they're great and they bring us joy. But at what cost? Like, if I gave you the opportunity to become a wild animal, a random wild animal right now, I could press a button and you're about to become a random wild animal somewhere in the world. And you think about the life that you're about to live, the death that you're probably about to experience, the fear that you're going to live until that happens. I think you kill yourself before I press the button. And I think that says everything we need to know about the state of suffering.
How do you work through this question? I mean, I'm sure it's come up for you.
Oh, it has. And it's a hard problem, I will grant you that. I do think your description, with the use of the word brutal throughout, is maybe a little extreme. That in fact, over all of these hundreds of millions of years of living things, there is incredible beauty in this tapestry of the things that have come to pass. And some joy has been experienced by those animals as well. I recognize most animals are not in a position really to be aware of their own mortality. So the idea that our idea of fear of death, which we carry around every hour, would be also felt in a broad way. I'm not sure that's true, but that's not sufficient. I can only understand this in the sense that, again, I see God as a God of order, having put in place natural laws that are going to govern the behavior of matter and energy. The idea that a creative process that involved a lot of supernatural interpositions in that effort was not the path that fit together with this rigorous, sort of scientifically well-designed plan, whereas evolution is this incredibly elegant way to achieve those goals. Yes, with a lot of pain and suffering, to be sure, although I don't think we have a full grasp of exactly what that experience might have been like hundreds of millions of years ago by all of those species. As long as you're going to say that life doesn't go on forever, all of those had to be ultimately dead anyway. So it's not as if it was only evolution that caused them to die. Many of them died a natural death. It's a hard problem, I grant you that. The data says that's what happened. So perhaps you will accuse me as a believer and then trying to rationalize that with the idea of why would God let that happen? And I do keep coming back to the idea that this feels like a reflection of God's interest in being a God of order, where once those laws are established, they're going to be followed. And at the very moment, at the Big Bang, the plan that would lead to us was in place, and it didn't have to be tweaked along the way the intelligent design people would say, in order to turn out right. It was perfect from the beginning with that outcome assured. And it wasn't blind, and it wasn't mindless. It was all kind of baked into the plan from the beginning. It may look random to us. I don't think it's random to God.
There's so much to say, of course. So one thing I do want to point out at the outset here is, broadly speaking, a lot of the time when I speak to theists and they say, look, I don't know why there's so much suffering. I can't explain that. But I can say that I believe in God, and I know that even if I don't know what the explanation is, I trust that there probably is one. I just don't know what it is. A lot of people say that, and I say, okay, fine. But then if we rewind a moment to fine-tuning, and I say, look, this is a strange mystery. In the same way that for a Christian, suffering is a great mystery, but I'm sure there's an explanation even if I don't know what it is. When I'm confronted with the great mystery of fine-tuning, I think I reserve the right to say, look, I don't know what a scientific explanation of this could look like, but I'm sure that there is one and we'll get there someday, right? I think, in other words, the cop-out, to put it crudely, if we were treating it in that way, in the context of a discussion about it, can go both ways. So I just want to make that, sort of put a pin in that. On the point of suffering, again, we run into this problem that, okay, broadly, maybe God has to bring about the world in a particular way. Maybe there has to be a kind of order. Maybe there has to be a kind of ecosystem. But it seems trivially true to me that an omnipotent deity could have organized the world so that there was not this kind of suffering. For example, we have animals who are obligate herbivores, right? They exist. We know that they can exist. We know that they do exist. He could have made all animals herbivores. That doesn't seem to, like, maybe that would sort of affect the ecosystem in a pretty dramatic way. But if from the very beginning you had these self-replicating beings and then life who were still sort of competing with each other for habitats and still maybe killing each other, not for food but for other reasons, but just were herbivores, you've eliminated an unfathomable amount of suffering. And when we say, like, okay, maybe I was being too dramatic when describing the brutality of life on Earth, like, I don't think that's true. David Attenborough once said, when people had criticized his documentaries for how much violence they included, he said, if you're upset by what we include, you should see what we leave on the cutting room floor. The natural world is filled with starvation and disease and predation. And just taking predation, when a lion kills a zebra, the zebra is usually too big to be killed instantly, so it will die over an agonizing death with its windpipe caught in the jaws of a lion. This could have been avoided. It doesn't seem to me that this kind of outcome is something that was necessary for producing the kind of ecosystem only through which could conscious human agents have come into existence to have loved God. I'm not even sure why the material world would need to exist in the first place if we're supposed to be ultimate.
Do you think all those
spiritual.
observations that you're making are moral observations, though?
No, but that's a good question, because of course people will say to me, look, Alex, you don't believe in morality, or you don't have a grounding for morality. How can you make these moral criticisms? That's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is, as Lincoln said of slavery, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I have no problem saying that, like, yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with predation and disease and starvation and all this kind of suffering. But that's an atheist paradigm. The atheist can say, well, there's nothing wrong with it, but we also expect it on our worldview. Right? The Christian says that this is a bad thing. We don't like that this is happening, but it is compatible with the existence of a good God. So I don't have to say that it's bad. I just have to say that I'm suspicious of the fact that if there were such a thing as objective goodness, that this would somehow be a part of that paradigm. This animal suffering is inexplicable to me. And again, if we say that, well, God had to create a balanced ecosystem that followed particular laws, it seems like an odd constraint that God simply had to use the process of animals tearing each other to shreds for billions of years and starving and dying in confused agony for billions of years. And that's the only possible way that we could have brought about human life. To be honest, the amount of suffering that's happened on this planet, if that really were the only way to bring about intelligent life on Earth, I'm not sure that it was even worth it.
I know what you're saying. I think it's not one that I find it easy to dismiss. Polkinghorne, the Anglican priest, who is also a physicist, writes about this and has designated this something he calls physical evil, that it is evil of a sort, but it is a consequence of physical laws. An earthquake that kills animals and people because of tectonic plates that are moving around, that are part of the way in which the laws of physics apply to our planet. Many of those were innocent people and animals, but they died anyway. That, in his description as a physicist, once again, sort of fits this. It all comes with the package. And unless you want God to start intervening at every step along the way, then it's unavoidable. And it must mean that God cared so much for the advent of people like us that could actually have a conversation like this about God, that it seemed in God's judgment worth it. You don't think it's worth it. That means you're disagreeing with my God, so we can decide whether he would like to enter the conversation.
Yeah, but also I don't know if that would be particularly consoling to the deer with its leg trapped under a fallen branch and dying of starvation with a broken leg. And you say to it, well, look, I know that you're suffering, but you have to understand all of this is in the service so that one day Francis Collins and Alex O'Connor can have an intelligent conversation about God's existence.
Appreciate that. Of course, if the deer had not been hurt in some predatory way, would have to die eventually, and probably an unpleasant experience either way. Are you trying to argue there shouldn't be death?
No, it's not death that I see as the problem. It's suffering. And in fact, a moment ago when you said that animals don't fear their mortality, I completely agree. But I do think that they experience fear and anxiety about predators.
In the acute.
And, sorry?
In the acute moment.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of fear that I was talking about. Death is not the problem for me, especially when we're considering the possibility of a Christian paradigm where death is just the beginning rather than the end. Of course, no problem at all.
But you want every animal to have a soft, sweet death.
Well, if possible, then yes. But maybe that's not possible. What I do think is possible is not having a system which is designed from the ground up to require the miserable, brutal death in order to progress the evolution of the species. That's what I think is possible. It might be that animals still suffer. I totally understand.
Hard to see how that wouldn't be the case.
Quite, like suffering is a natural result of creating a world in which there are free agents living in a material world. Of course, there are questions about why that paradigm needs to be created in the first place. But sure, suffering. But the problem of evil is not so much about the existence of evil per se, but its sheer depth, the level. You know, that there are so many ways conceivably that God could reduce the suffering that's baked into the system. He might not need to intervene in particular cases.
Sure.
Because I understand if this particular animal is about to suffer and God sort of comes down from the heavens and protects him, then he's playing favorites. And that just is a totally unfeasible situation. And he couldn't do that every time. But when it's baked into the system, and it seems like that little tweak, well, let's make the animals herbivores. Or let's have the teeth of predators contain a kind of natural anesthetic, so that when they sort of eat the prey, you know, the prey are sort of, you know what I mean? Like just there's so many conceivable ways.
Those are also supernatural interventions because they would not happen by natural process.
Well, unless it was just in the same way that there are natural, they're all kind of natural things which have effects on our lives. Like, you know, there are plants that give us hallucinogenic experiences and stuff. Like, it doesn't seem crazy to me to think that they could have evolved saliva in a lion that has anesthetic properties. That doesn't seem like a supernatural intervention in that case.
Yeah, because then that means that there would be some other pressure than advantage to the lion. It may not be at all to the advantage to the lion to have some sort of anesthetic in its jaws. That may actually be a disadvantage. So if you're once going to accept the fact that it's an ordered universe and life is going to evolve according to that, then it's going to evolve according to that, no matter whether it feels like I wouldn't have done it that way because of suffering.
Do you feel the same about the herbivore example? And these are kind of sort of crude examples, but like the herbivore example.
I hadn't really thought about it. It's hard for me to think how God could sort of step in and make sure that the evolution of those genomes avoided a pathway that led to a carnivore. That does seem like another one of those supernatural interventions that, for what I can see, is a very strong reason God decided not to interfere with. We can come to miracles later on about things that God chose to do to lift those rules and very special circumstances, those great ganglions of history, as Lewis calls them, had a message to send.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these questions that you're asking, then, you know, you could look at philosophy, and then people obviously look to world religions to try to answer some of these questions. And so even when I think about the word suffering that keeps coming up over and over and over again. The next thing we would talk about was the resurrection of Jesus, because the Christian story, at least, would propose, that there is a reason, even though we don't fully know the reason why these things are being allowed, but that God subjected himself to that same suffering, and that was seen with Jesus on the cross. And so let's talk about the resurrection a little bit and how that intersects with, so why do you find the resurrection to be compelling as something that actually happened in human history? Like, what led you to that conclusion?
Well, there's a lot of records that one can look at, and those who are inclined to pick at each one of them can probably do so. But certainly the records of the New Testament of Jesus' life and the teachings that he put forward in that very short period of time where we have that information seem, for the most part, pretty reliable on the basis of multiple individuals writing down very similar findings. And the fact that he was, in fact, crucified seems to fit quite well with practices that were going on at the time. I think it's pretty hard to say Jesus was a myth. That's what I thought when I was growing up. But I think the evidence for Jesus' literal historical existence,
that seems to be accepted.
Seems pretty much as convincing as, the same of Julius Caesar. And the fact that he was put to death on a cross also seems entirely supportable by the data that we have from various sources. And before we get to the resurrection part, the fact that he did die on the cross, an unimaginably painful and difficult way to have one's life ended, is something that of the Christian faith I find particularly helpful when I'm struggling with suffering for people I love, or even sometimes for myself. I don't have to explain to God what suffering is like and why it's really horrible, because God isn't an observer. God's a participant in that. That's somehow reassuring, and that's not true of all faiths, but it's true of my faith. And then the resurrection, that 3 days later, the tomb was empty. The stone had rolled away, and that multiple witnesses saw what appeared to be the risen Christ in various settings before the ascension. Those require serious attention. And when you consider that many of those individuals went to their deaths asserting that as a reality, and were not recanting that claim to save themselves at the last, is impossible to set aside. How many people would do that if they knew it was not true? If you have not read Tom Wright's 738-page The Resurrection of the Son of God, that had a big influence on me.
He's at Oxford, right?
Yes, he is.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's a friend, but I read this long before I knew him. And the way in which he puts together the case from both biblical and non-biblical sources, I found very compelling. Is it absolute proof? No, otherwise everybody would have decided to agree with it. But I find it very compelling. I think on the basis of the evidence there, trying to decide what's the most likely outcome, apply Occam's razor to this situation. The most likely explanation is that he really was raised from the dead. Now, you might say to me, wait a minute, you're a scientist, and you've just been talking about how God put these natural laws in place that weren't to be broken. This is breaking them in a huge way. Well, yeah, but if they're God's laws, and God chose in this exceptional moment to suspend them, to do the most important thing that had ever been done, then sure, God has the power to do that too. I can go with that.
I mean, you've had so many people on your podcast talking about this, about the resurrection.
Yeah.
You've had William Lane Craig on. You've had Bart Ehrman on.
Yes.
A lot of people opposing viewpoints. What is your current perspective of the resurrection?
What do you got against it?
Well, I think it would be great if Christianity were true. There's a lot about, if we look at what the Gospels actually say, I think might be out of accord with what Christians tend to actually believe about Jesus. But the resurrection is something that the Gospels press quite hard, and the New Testament presses quite hard. I am, broadly speaking, suspicious of the veracity of the accounts for a number of reasons. I think that there are, particularly the Gospels, are a big mix of legend, attempted biography, and theologizing. I think that, for example, the birth narratives, I don't believe that this actually happened. I think there's good reason to think that in at least one case, the birth narrative was added later than the rest of the gospel was written. I think these are quite obviously legendary accounts of the kind that we often see in ancient biographies of trying to give people spectacular births. Somebody sort of imagining that this must be the case with Jesus. That there are a lot of reasons to think that that might be the case. We don't have.
You are aware that lots of people distree about those.
Oh, of course.
How do you as we're talking back and forth, how do you discern, and I talked about this stuff about evidence proof earlier, and then just trusting sources of information. How do you guys go about being like, I think there's good evidence to suggest that this? So like, where would you be getting your sources, and where would you be getting your sources for this?
When it comes to the Gospels, I think that we have to sort of look at cross-source corroboration, right? And so, broadly speaking, we have the Synoptic Gospels, which most scholars believe Mark comes first, and then Luke and Matthew use Mark. They're aware of Mark. They copy it sometimes verbatim, but they also seem to have this source of quotations of Jesus, which has been called Q for quell, the German word for source, right? We don't know if that exists or not. If it does, then we've got this extra source Q. If we don't, then we essentially just have, Matthew and Luke's other source, wherever they got that information, right? There's also stuff that's only in Matthew. So broadly speaking, scholars will refer to that, wherever that came from, as just M, and the stuff that's only in Luke as L. And then you have John's Gospel, which seems to not know of the Synoptic Gospels, and it's like totally different, right? And so we have different sources that we can pull out from these stories.
Is kind of what you would expect.
Exactly, right? And so we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, we've got Q, we've got M, we've got L, we've got all of these different sort of sources. And what I think is that when a story occurs independently across numerous of these sources, there's good reason to think that it happened. And when it only occurs in one, we can't say it didn't, but we have less good reason to think that it did.
Sure.
So for example, the story of doubting Thomas only appears in John's Gospel. That makes me sort of like less confident that it happened as a historical fact than I would be of stories that appeared in all of the Gospels, for example. So like the crucifixion, for example, happened. We have all kinds of evidence to produce that happened from all kinds of different sources, right? Maybe the story of doubting Thomas happened, maybe, but I can't say that with the same.
So you believe that Jesus was crucified?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. And I think that I can't think of a scholar who would not think that's the case, except someone like Richard Carrier or someone who's a Jesus mythicist altogether.
He wasn't really killed on the cross.
Oh, and of course, Muslims. Of course, yeah. That's another large group of people who probably don't think that.
But Alex, you're coming at this with priors that we should probably talk about.
Yeah, sure.
Approach the Gospels. You're approaching as a skeptic.
Mhm.
And so when you find evidence of something that doesn't quite measure up with the cleanest possible explanation, you intend to ascribe value to that as something, aha, there you see. There's a reason for me to be skeptical about doubting Thomas, because it only appears once. Whereas I come at that and think, there are 4 different perspectives, one of them very different, and it has this particular story. That's a really interesting story. I don't know why I should feel doubtful that it's true on that basis, because my prior is there's a lot here that really rings true for me.
It's not that you should think that it probably didn't happen or something. What I'm saying is that we have less confidence in the historicity of the story of doubting Thomas than we do in the crucifixion. I think you'd probably agree with that too, right? Like if you had to say which are you more certain happened, right? Exactly. So that's what I'm saying is as a starting point to see how we can.
But your introduction to the Gospels was all about the skeptic part. And mine is more about, wow, there is such truth and beauty here.
Yeah.
Our priors are different.
Of course, for me, I'm looking at these as ancient texts and trying to uncover what they mean. What were the authors trying to do? What did they achieve in doing? And what is the genre of this text? Like, what are we attempting to do here? For example, I think that John's Gospel is much more theological. It seems like the author of John's Gospel was trying to be more theological.
Yeah, that comes across.
And so, well, that might be, if we were talking about Doubting Thomas, for example, Doubting Thomas is a very moralized message. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. You know, it's about empiricism. It's about what. And so it seems that if you've got a author who's trying to do theology more, that sort of fits in with that picture, right? So when I'm trying to understand these texts, I'm looking at what am I dealing with here, right? And the reason that I bring up those different sources is to say that if something occurs in all of them, then I think we've got very good reason to think that it's true. One thing that Bart Ehrman presses quite hard, and I think he's probably right about this, is Jesus as the apocalyptic prophet. It seems that Jesus believed that the world was about to end. And we have like a few reasons to think that those quotes where he's talking about the world as about to end are probably accurate. And that they wouldn't be made up by like, you know, future followers of Jesus. One interesting example of this, by the way, is when Jesus says that to his 12 disciples, he says that, you know, after this all happens, the 12 of you will be sat on the 12 thrones, which is a weird thing to say given that Judas was among the 12 he was talking to, implying that Judas is going to be on one of these 12 thrones. That doesn't seem like something a future Christian would have made up when they knew that Jesus betrayed him. And so it's likely that this is something Jesus actually said, right? Because it wouldn't have been made up, right? And he's so, okay, we've got this like apocalyptic Jesus. So there are things that I think we can be more confident about and things I think we can be less confident about. Where does Jesus claim in his own words to be God? In John's Gospel, before Abraham was, I am, right? Invoking the godly name. That only appears in John's Gospel, the theological Gospel. It doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels. Now, does that mean that we can think it didn't happen? Well, maybe not. Like it would be an argument from silence to say that the other sources don't mention it. But it does seem strange that if Jesus did actually just explicitly say at one point that he is God, that the other gospel writers just sort of didn't think that it was relevant to include in their stories.
Well, so you think
And so because it only appears in one source, in other words, I think that's another reason to think that it's less likely to happen.
So you believe Jesus was a real person, he was crucified. Mm-hmm. What is your interpretation of the events afterwards? What do you believe happened?
So the reason why I'm bringing all of this up is to say, like, well, what can we know actually happened? Well, it seems that Jesus was crucified. And then what do our sources say about the resurrection? Well, Mark's gospel, the earliest manuscripts don't have the end of Mark's gospel. There's a longer ending of Mark, which isn't in the earliest manuscript. So the earliest account that we have of Jesus, or rather a sort of biographical account, because Paul's letters are earlier than that, but a biographical account. The earliest biographical account we have is Mark. And the earliest versions of Mark don't contain any post-resurrection appearances at all. The story ends with the woman coming to the tomb, and the tomb is empty, but that's where it ends. And as the sources get later, so we get Matthew and Luke and John, the witnesses increase and the stories become more fanciful and theological. So then in Matthew, you get the appearance to the disciples. In Luke, you get the road to Emmaus, which is further. In John, it's only in John that you get the stories like Doubting Thomas, where he's appearing. So the later the source is, it seems like the more witnesses we have, and the more fanciful and theological the story gets. And so, again, hypotheses. Did this really happen? And it just so happens that the later the source, the more detailed they become. Or is it the case that this was a mythological development that happened after Jesus died, and that's why the later the source is written, the more mythological and the more convoluted these appearances become? It seems to me better explained by that mythological development, especially considering that even the earliest gospel was already written decades after the death of Christ.
And the fact that all of the disciples went to their deaths except for John, proclaiming this, and were martyred as a result.
How do we know that?
By the descriptions we have.
So I'm genuinely asking, by the way, because I'm not sure about this. Again, I'm also not a historian. I'm just an atheist YouTuber, right? Like, and by the way, that's one of the things that I love about these conversations, and why I've so liked doing the podcast and having people like William Lane Craig and Bart Ehrman on, because unlike previously where I'd make a video essay, did Jesus rise from the dead, or I do a debate, you kind of have to have the argument and the point where I can sit down with these guys and be like, but hold on, like, Bart, like how do you explain, how what happened then? You know, or like with
This with Tom Wright, that would be fun. I'd pay
I would love to. I'd love to have
to have that one happen.
have Dr. Wright on the show. Yeah. So the disciples going to their death. Like I think the Gospels record the death of two of the disciples, if I'm not mistaken. You've got Judas's suicide, and one more, I think. But in other words, I actually don't know how like historically accepted it is that the disciples went to their death for their beliefs, and it may very well be.
But a lot of it goes back to like tradition, church tradition, stuff like that, and then even cross-referencing. So William and Craig, what he goes back to is Paul's statement, I think in 1 Corinthians, about the creed that was established, which he says is within 5 years of Jesus's death or something like that, and then Paul's established all the main facts of the resurrection, and that he points to at least as something that is proof of this entire thing actually taking place, corroborated with other instances.
So Paul didn't. This is it gets really interesting, right? Because there's so much to unpack here, because people will say, okay, Alex, you've said that as the stories go on, the stories become more fanciful, and the resurrection becomes sort of more of a cemented thing. But what about Paul? Because Paul is earlier than the Gospels, and Paul writes about like 500 people, witnessing Jesus, and Paul seems to believe in the resurrection. Yes, but Paul is not an eyewitness to the resurrection.
No.
Right? I don't think the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses either, but like a lot of Christians believe that they were. And so...
Well, technically, he says in Damascus, he was an eyewitness that way.
He witnesses the risen Christ in a very particular kind of way. He's not witnessing a bodily resurrection of Christ, which is the kind of thing we're trying to establish right now.
Yeah.
And so like, I can totally imagine that Paul believed in a resurrected Jesus, and that he really did see a big blinding flash of light on the road to Damascus, and that convinced him of Jesus' existence. He did not meet a physically resurrected human being that he'd spent years traveling with and was able to sort of look at and interact with and thrust the hand into the wound to make sure it was him. And so it seemed much more plausible to me that Paul could have been mistaken than that like a disciple who thought he saw a physically resurrected Jesus who he'd spent years with could be mistaken. Paul is the earlier source, sure, but he's also the less reliable source because he wasn't an eyewitness for that reason.
Again, your prior is to be suspicious of his conclusion.
Well, you talked about, in your most recent book, you talked about cognitive bias a lot. And I think we do, whatever your worldview is, I think you default to that. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian, if you're not a Christian.
And can I just say as well, like with the fine-tuning thing, like something very weird happened on Easter morning, right? Like something very strange happened at this point in history. And even if you're just trying to sociologically account for the beginning of a Christian movement, I mean, it's a fascinating thing to try to explain. And I guess, I'm kind of coming at this with the priors of suspicion, but part of that is because that's the conversation that I'm trying to have, right? Yeah. In the same way, and I mean this sincerely, if I was sat with like a hardcore atheist or a Jesus mythicist, I would be like hammering the Christian scholarship as best as I could to do that too. But I'm interested in what your priors are here, Dr. Collins. Like what do you think you sort of bring to the table when you open this book?
Again, I came to faith in this journey that began in an atheist perspective, and then recognized that point of view could not really hold up to even rational argument. If somebody once said to me, suppose you had to draw a circle that represents all the knowledge in the universe, what would that look like? And of course, okay, now drawing within that the circle that represents what you know and you ever will know on this earth. So suppose the knowledge of God's existence is outside your circle. Seems plausible on the scale.
Mm-hmm.
How could you then say, I know there is no God, and be sure of it?
Yeah, and I think anybody who says that is firstly mistaken about their epistemic capabilities, and secondly probably not thinking of the right kind of God, right? I think that's probably the case.
Right. Well, so
I agree with you.
An easy way to kind of get away from the far end of that spectrum we talked about earlier, into something that was more of, okay, let's figure out what might be outside of what I currently know, and what would it say about this question? And again, we traveled, as we talked about earlier, through the structure of the universe as an indicator of, for me, a pretty impressive mind that is behind the way in which the whole thing has been put together. And then on to the direction of, does God care about me? And on to the direction of good and evil. We talked about that earlier, and I wanted to come back to it. Because you are arguing that, if I understood you, that you can't really say that the Judeo-Christian tradition claims to have an insight about good and evil, because you can see things in the Bible that we would now say are evil that were considered okay as part of that practice, the treatment of women, slaves, the Canaanites, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a really important distinction here. If you look down through all cultures, people of faith or not, I will be challenged to find any culture that didn't agree there was such a thing as good and a thing that was evil. But they might disagree profoundly about what fits in each list.
Mm-hmm.
And things that we would now say are evil might have been considered not just okay, but actually laudable in other faiths, other cultures. But they would still argue, yes, there's a good and there's an evil, and we're supposed to do the good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And why is that? And that's, again, where I found it difficult to explain that away on a purely evolutionary sociobiology kind of direction. And that forced me into this recognition that there is a source there that I can't explain scientifically. And if I was looking for a source outside of science, it seems like it's a holy source that cares about good and wants me to follow that rule, even though I'm pretty lousy at it. And that adds a whole other dimension to this mathematical physicist God, who now is a God of love and of goodness, who's calling me to do the same. So I approach the New Testament in that same perspective. And I be quite honest, I have not delved into a lot of the debates amongst New Testament theologians about M and Q and what got added here and what got subtracted there. I just have not felt the need for that, because what I read through there is actually ringing true to me as something that represents what I think I need to know in big sweeping terms about God and about Jesus. I do find it compelling as far as not just the life and the crucifixion, but the resurrection. But I know I can't prove that. But sometimes I get tired of all the arguments of the Jesus group and theologians on one side or the other sort of seem to be missing the point. What is it we're really trying to take away from this?
Yeah.
Did Jesus really walk amongst us? Did he really speak the words in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, which is just so radical, so incredibly outside of what you would have expected for the Son of God to be saying, calling us to love not just our neighbors, but our enemies. It must have been radical at the time. It must have set people completely on their ears to hear that. And we're still supposed to hear it. And that calls to me. I can't unread that. And I can't take away from what I see. And again, maybe I'm too much influenced by those 738 pages that Tom writes, Resurrection of the Son of God, to build, as he builds there, a really compelling case. Not an absolute proof, but a compelling case for the most likely conclusion that the resurrection really happened. And if so, that's the most important event that ever happened in history. And I don't want to waste my time unnecessarily in debating points about this bit of scripture or that. It conveys a certain kind of compelling truth that I'm willing to take on board without being certain that it's absolutely true.
Yeah. I think most Christians probably think in the same way about the resurrection of Jesus, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And people come to believe for all kinds of reasons, right? There are people who say that they come to believe in God. Lee Strobel is a good example of this, someone who seems to just investigate the evidence for the resurrection, and that's what does it. But I think that's not the most usual case. I think more commonly people come to believe in God for other reasons, for moral reasons, for social reasons, or because it speaks to them in a way that they can't quite explain. And then they come to the Gospels with this sense that they know it's true, and they sort of want to learn more about it, right? And I think that is perfectly legitimate. But of course, in my sort of worldview here as an atheist or someone who doesn't believe in Christianity and the resurrection of Jesus. When somebody comes to me and says, "Well, then hold on, what about this historical case of the resurrection?" That's where I kind of have to get a bit nitpicky, because I'm like, okay, well, if you're going to confront me with evidence for the resurrection, then I'm going to say, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this? But I totally understand that as a personal quest to understand, the nature of Christianity and coming to know Jesus as a Christian, this is probably like an inappropriate approach to that, right? But as somebody who's confronted with the evidence, that's the approach that one has to take.
I think I got to ask you then: is the path towards making a decision about belief or non-belief, is that a totally rational path, or is there room there for revelation?
Oh, I think if I experienced revelation, I think that could be a kind of rational. Depends what you mean by rational. But if, like, what do you mean? Do you mean, will it be purely like argumentative?
Oh, no, I mean, there are certainly people who come to faith on a purely emotional basis. I had this experience. I realized God is real. Jesus spoke to me. I honor that. I recognize that. That's not happened to me. But I have had those moments of feeling like there is something more than I can explain that seems to be part of a relationship that I'm trying to build on and often wondering if it's there, but once in a while it is. I'll tell you a story. Just a year and a half ago, as I'm praying about a book I had read, which was about sort of the kind of spiritual discipline that one ought to utilize if you're really going to get yourself closer to an understanding of what your faith is all about. And praying about that and realizing I'm not very disciplined in my faith. And my prayer life, Alex, is mostly a seeking of understanding of something I'm wrestling with. And the skeptic would say, well, that's fine. We should all do that. And so it's just in your head. But it feels like more than that. It feels like it's an opportunity to get some incoming insights that I maybe can't quite manage on my own. And I almost never get a real specific message, almost never. And this time I did. And it was quite jarring because it wasn't a particularly happy message, but it's changed the way I'm thinking about things for the last year and a half. And the message was this: don't waste your time. You may not have much left. Now, that was true the day I was born. You don't, any of us have much time left if we're willing to think about it. But this seemed very pointed. It came a few months before I got a diagnosis of prostate cancer, so maybe that was part of the premonition of what lie ahead. But it's really affected me that this is a message that requires attention and that I don't think just came out of my own head, because it's not one I would have chosen, but it's a calling of some sort, and not to put yourself in a place where days go by and you're just spending your time on things that really don't matter. Invest in relationships, especially loving relationships. Invest in things that might alleviate the suffering that you and I both worry a lot about. In my case, as a doctor, and human suffering. Invest in ways that maybe could bring people back together at a time where we all seem so divided and mad at each other about everything. It has that effect. Now, again, that was revelation. That was not I sat down and did a logical experiment here and figured out that was the message I need to hear, and then I had it. It's like, whoa, surprised me. That's what I mean by revelation. My coming to faith had some of those moments as well, where I could reason myself close to the answer, but it required something more than that to actually take the leap. And I guess coming back to you, because I want to turn the tables on you, what kind of that revelation have you had, or would it take for you to put aside all of the rational arguments, which clearly lead you in this direction, but it doesn't sound to me like you're 100% sure you're right. And can you imagine such a thing that would change your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I would love for that to happen. I mean, I don't know exactly what it's like. I was going to ask you a question. I don't want to sort of answer your question with a question, but like, what does it feel like, or what did it feel like to to be sat there praying, and there are thoughts flittering through your head, and you're thinking about taking out the trash, and then there's this one thought that appears in your head that you feel sort of isn't yours, and how it is that you identify. I mean, you said a moment ago that it's because it feels like the kind of thought that you wouldn't have had or wanted to have. So there's that, but like, I don't know, does it strike you? Do you hear it? Do you see it? You know, what?
I felt it. The words were very explicit. It wasn't like a nebulous kind of idea. It was those specific words. Don't waste your time. You may not have much left. And it did not make sense for this to be something that my mind was likely to have come up with, because it was not what I wanted to hear as I'm in the middle of that prayer moment, which was a serious prayer moment. I was reasonably well focused, not expecting this.
Yeah. Well, I can say that if I had that kind of experience, I don't know if I had that experience in isolation that I would sort of believe in God, just because I've heard some kind of thought that maybe if the nature of the thought was different, if the nature of the thought was distinctly like, here I am, something like that, then if I sort of heard a voice, so to speak, that said something like, you know, don't waste your time, you might not have much left, or said something like, you should spend more time with your mother, or something like that, then I would think that'd probably, like, you know, increase my credence in God's existence to some minimal degree. But I'd consider it this sort of happy mystery. If the nature of the message was theological in tone, and it struck me with that kind of surprise and intrigue, then I would absolutely, I would love for that to happen. I really would. And I wouldn't rule it out. And I think that one of the most legitimate ways to come to believe in God, if not the most legitimate way, is through sort of personal experience and revelation. It's not the kind of thing that's going to convince another person. That's why it's laughed out of the room in debates. If you're doing a public debate with somebody, like if we were here having a debate and you were trying to sort of convince me that God existed, and you said, well, I had this sort of message from God, then everyone would laugh you out of the room, because that's not going to convince anybody. But that's not supposed to convince anybody. As far as it's convincing you, it's like the most legitimate way imaginable.
That's right.
To come to believe in God. And so, of course, that way. And so when people asked me, you know, what would it take? I would highly doubt that I would be reading the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, and I'd be on objection to subheading 3 to the modal ontological argument. I don't think that one's in there actually, but maybe like the Leibnizian cosmological argument. And I go like, there, and I get out my pen, I underline it. I'm like, there he is, I found it. You know, I don't think that's how it's going to happen.
It's hiding there,
right? Exactly. And also there's a kind of it's kind of elitism that comes along with that kind of thought, which is that if you have the time and the intellect and the studious sort of intellectual constitution and the schooling and whatnot, that you can understand this argument, and you've got the money to buy the book and the time to sit down and read it, and that's how you come to believe in God. If that's how you're supposed to come to believe in God, then that would make God a pretty unfair administrator of his love, right? And so it's clear that that's not how it's supposed to be done.
Brings to mind Matthew 11, Jesus' words, I thank you, or I praise you, God, that you have hidden these things from the wise and revealed them to little children. And he's talking about the awareness of faith and its reality.
Yes.
So we've been talking about things that maybe appeals to the wise, but I'm not sure.
Having said that, I'm sure that God meets you where you're at, as they say. And of course, if God is everywhere and God pervades the natural world, then of course you will find him in the biological cell, and you will find him in the galaxies and the laws of the universe and whatnot.
I want to ask you that too, because again, for me, looking back when I was an atheist or an agnostic, the moments where I had those glimpses of something that made me worried that I missed out were those surprising moments of the numinous. For me, oftentimes music, the second movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony, the funeral march in that C minor, incredibly aching music that brings tears to your eyes even though you didn't expect it. And somehow that aching longing comes into mind, and you're like, there's something here I'm supposed to be part of more often, but it's gone about as soon as you grasp it. or something beautiful in terms of art, although it's often for me the music. Does that happen to you to get those glimpses of, I mean, C.S. Lewis calls that joy, that we're surprised by joy,
Yeah.
the name of his book. Do you get those, and what do they mean?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought this up again, because I remember earlier when you used the word longing, and I've always identified the feeling of beauty as something a bit like longing, in a way that's also, okay, so I think that the word beauty is one of the most like promiscuous terms in the English language. I think that like
It's joy.
we refer to a bunch of different, like categorically different things and kinds of things as beautiful. I think that music is beautiful. I think my wife is beautiful. I think that meal was beautiful. We're meaning totally different things, right?
Rooted it all up.
And so we have to sort of hyper focus here, right? So like with music, for example, it is an incredible mystery that you can like play some notes on a keyboard that vibrates the air in such a way as to bring up very specific emotions in a person. That's incredible. And like, yeah, I've experienced that, right? And I feel very lucky to have experienced that. With painting and art, it took a long time. I used to sort of not really enjoy it or get it. A lot of it had to do with contextualizing the art and learning a little bit about why it was painted, when it was painted, what the world was like, what this bit of art would have meant there and then. That now I'm a sucker for art and galleries. I think it's great, and I've tried to pay attention to like, what is going on? What's happening there, right?
What does this say to you?
And I wonder. I've often felt like it's longing seems to fulfill the bill, at least in some of those cases, because
Longing for what?
if you look at that's the question, right?
Yeah.
That's the question. If you look at, and this is why, by the way, I understand why people use this argument from beauty to God, because like, what is this thing that you're longing for? Well, maybe it's something like some kind of intrinsic maximum of beauty. I find that quite difficult to cognize. I find that difficult to sort of look at a painting and a bit of music and a really good pizza. I think the thing that they all sort of have in common that's pulling me to, if I sort of push those together, I sort of get a God-looking figure. Maybe though, I don't know. But I do think that if you pay attention to someone's facial expression, right? When you walk around the corner, you see a beautiful painting and someone's captured by it. What face do they look at it? Do they smile? Do they go like, oh, no? It's they sort of go, like their face is like, it almost looks, if you took a picture of the face and showed it to somebody, it looks almost like scared, or it looks upset, or it looks like uncomfortable. It's sort of like you know what I mean? Like it's sort of like, it's that crunched up face.
Yeah, I want to have that. It's an ache.
So it's almost like it's almost a negative emotion. Like the feeling of beauty is almost negative rather than positive. So why is it that people love it so much? Why is it that they chase it out? And that's where I think you also get this stereotype of the,
Well, there's awe and wonder too.
or what this is. So the what is it that Rudolf Otto said? The mysterium tremendum et fascinans. The mystery that sort of fascinates you, but also makes you tremble, or something like that. You know, it's this, and he's using that to describe the numinous, the holy. It's terrifying at the same time as being fascinating. You're like pulled in and pushed away at the same time. And I think if you think about the cliche of the suffering artist, you know, the poet and the painter, and they have a terrible life, and you know they almost enjoy the suffering because it brings them better art. What is all of this telling us? It's telling us that there's something about beauty which is about negativity and disconnect and suffering. And maybe it's something about feeling the suffering. If somebody suffers enough, they get the feeling that there's a way the world is supposed to be that it's not.
Yeah.
And once you realize there's a way that the world is supposed to be, that gives you teleology. And once you get that teleology, you can start expressing the desire for that end in art. But I mean, that the fact that is a negative emotion, I think is interesting. That's an open question to me. By the way, I remember once I was sat, we were in Corinth, on top of this hill, sort of looking over the view of Corinth. And I said to my friend, I said, he's a Christian, and I said to him, oh, what do you make when you see like a beautiful view like this? Like what's going on in your head? trying to understand, someone who believes in God, what do they make of beauty and stuff? And he kind of just shut me down. He turned around and said, Alex, when you analyze something, you try to take possession of it. When you enjoy something, you let it take possession of you. And that just about shut me up. I was like,
That's not a bad response.
I was like, fair enough. Maybe I'm spending too much time doing the analysis. The moment you begin to ask the question, what's going on in my brain as I look at this painting, you're kind of doing the wrong thing.
Oh, yeah. That's not going to help you experience the awe very much.
Yeah. So in other words, I do experience that. I don't know what to make of it. I think it would be a bit crude, as some like analytic philosophers do, to sort of say, well, this is an argument for the existence of God. But I understand what you're saying, that it seems to sort of point to something a bit sort of out there, a bit sort of numinous.
If you were looking for evidence that you could experience that God is out there and looking for a relationship with you, this feels like one of those candidates.
I think music is the best there, because paintings are tricky because they're human-made, and of course, like, music is human-made as well, but humans didn't make that effect. No. Humans didn't create that ability they discovered it, And there's a similar way in which that's true with like the way that colors are beautiful and put together, but paintings are so often representations of real world objects. But music is just this thing, which also, by the way, seems completely unnecessary. It seems that like there's no reason why we would need, as like evolved creatures, to develop this faculty for beauty.
There is. And there's
for music,
of our brain now that responds to music differently than it does to speech, which means it's there for a reason. It's evolved really to recognize musical tones. There's a circuit that recognizes pitch. There's one that recognizes intervals between the preceding note and the note you just heard. And most interestingly, there's a circuit that predicts the next note.
But do you think there's a survival benefit?
There must be.
In like not just being able to tell different pitches apart and stuff, but like of the ability to enjoy music.
Enjoy and draw others together with you. Mothers singing lullabies to their babies before maybe they even could speak a language. People getting together to mourn a disastrous situation or a loved one.
Okay.
Or getting together to sing a fight song.
Well, okay, maybe there is a reductionistic evolutionary explanation. I don't know. Maybe we should swap seats.
The one to ruin it, but, no, there's some there, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have the same significance for us, just as I don't think the fact that we can talk about these things means that they are less likely to be important to God. Our brains are intended to provide the substance by which we can achieve revelations that we wouldn't have been able to do.
Yeah, I do wish I had a bit more interesting to say about, from like an atheist side, about the beauty stuff. I think the only way to do that would just to offer some kind of like reductionistic account of why the human brain has evolved to sort of be able to tell pictures apart, and some of them are more pleasing and others, and then we've like co-opted that to create, artificially stimulating things with like pianos and guitars. And I'm sure we could do that, but like you say, let's not waste time. I think most people probably are aware that kind of argument could be made. It's still a wonderful mystery, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think that the key thing here throughout all of this is that, like, I'm not convinced by fine-tuning that it's like a good reason to believe in God, but it's a great mystery. The Christian isn't convinced by suffering that there is no God and that this undermines everything, but it is a great and terrible mystery. The beauty is a great and perhaps terrible mystery as well. The resurrection is a strange moment in history, like what happened on Easter morning. It's all an incredible mystery. And I think anybody who professes confidence in the knowledge of any of these things is either like a really, really talented physicist who actually just does know a ton about fine-tuning and can probably like school both of us, fine. But when it comes to those sort of big consequential questions about the existence of God and stuff like that, and what beauty really means, man, like if somebody professes that kind of confidence on questions like that, then I immediately treat them with suspicion. Maybe that's one of my priors.
We've covered a lot of ground today. The last question I wanted to give both of you, because you're coming from differing perspectives, but why do you feel like this question matters that we've been exploring in this entire conversation? Like, you clearly explore these realms on your own podcasts constantly, and you've dedicated your whole life after coming to faith?
It's the most important question. Is there a God? I defy anybody to come up with one that matters more than that. I don't want to go all the way to Pascal's wager, but if there is a God and God cares about me and I'm ignoring that, that feels like a really bad way to live your life, much less whatever comes after. If there isn't a God and I'm wasting my time by worshiping something that's not there, that's a really bad outcome too. This is a really important question. And yet I think until I was 25 years old and one of my patients lying in a bed suffering from terrible heart disease asked me, "What do you believe, doctor?" I had paid no attention to that question. And I didn't like it, but it was the right question. It's still the right question. I have my own answer. Alex has a different one, but we're both on a road. And it's hard to know exactly what that road will lead us to.
Yeah. I think Christopher Hitchens once said that the road to Damascus is not a one-way street. So we don't know which way we're traveling necessarily, but you're quite right that we're on that road. I think that it is an interesting question at sort of first crude analysis. Like it's an interesting, think of this question of God's existence. You sit down at the pub with somebody and you're talking about God, and you could go anywhere with this person. If I meet a Christian in a pub and say, "Why do you believe in God?" I might be about to talk about physics. I might be about to talk about beauty and poetry or history or biblical scholarship. There's so much contained in this world of discussion that even if you're just interested in science or you're just interested in ethics or you're just interested in history, this like God question just allows you to explore all of that. So it's interesting. What is it Lewis said about I don't know if he was talking about the resurrection particularly or about Christianity, that it's either the most important truth in the world, or if it's not true, then it's like trivially false. The one thing it can't be is
uninteresting or
is sort of important. It's either the most interesting or the least interesting question in the world. It can't be kind of important. And so why is this important? Well, if God exists, as Dr. Collins says, it is the most important question that exists. If God doesn't exist and all of this is fabricated or mistaken, then more important questions would include things like, what are we going to have for dinner tonight? And, what's your favorite song, right? Because if it's untrue, whatever, it's sort of inconsequential. But in that sort of Pascalian spirit, as long as there is that possibility of that truth, the sort of infinitude of utility that comes from that makes it probably worth exploring even for an atheist.
It's beautiful, man.
Totally agree.
Well, thank you guys for being here.
Well, it's good to end on a point of agreement, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.